The first thing Marcus Reed noticed was the smell. It wasn't smoke, at least not yet. It was the sharp metallic tang of fresh-cut steel mixed with the sweet chemical bite of new paint, the kind contractors used to make everything look finished before it was finished. It was the smell of a building pretending. He stood on the sidewalk across from the new Riverbend Flats complex, a six-story ribbon of glass and pale stone that had been rising all summer along the edge of downtown. The leasing banners flapped like victory flags. Luxury living, rooftop pool, move-in specials. There was even a staged lobby visible through the front windows. Potted plants, gold-framed mirrors, a couch too white to be real. Marcus adjusted the strap of his worn messenger bag and watched the workers in neon vests stream in and out like ants. He was early, which meant he had time to listen. He listened to the building. A distant hammer. A forklift's beep, beep, beep. The rumble of a generator. The hiss of an air compressor. Somewhere inside, water ran through pipes that were supposed to be tested, documented, certified. Water that, in a real emergency, would decide who lived and who didn't. Marcus's phone buzzed. Tasha. You there? You sure you want to do this? He stared at the message and swallowed. He didn't answer right away because he didn't want to lie and say he was calm. He was sure he wanted to do it. He just wasn't sure how much it was going to cost him. Emotionally, professionally, maybe even physically. He typed back, "Here. And yeah, if I'm right, someone's gonna get hurt if nobody speaks up." He hit send, then shoved the phone into his pocket as if the decision could be sealed by fabric and gravity. Marcus Reed had lived his whole life learning the difference between being right and being believed. At 32, he was a fire protection technician, licensed, experienced, and meticulous to the point that his coworkers used to joke he could hear a leaky valve the way musicians heard a wrong note. He'd started as an apprentice right out of community college, working his way up through the unglamorous guts of buildings. Sprinkler risers, backflow preventers, control valves, inspectors' test connections. It wasn't a job that got you applause. It was a job that only mattered when everything else went wrong. And it mattered now. Because 3 days earlier, Marcus had been called to Riverbend Flats for a routine pre-occupancy inspection on the sprinkler system. It should have been simple. Verify the installation matched the plans. Check valves were open and supervised. Confirm alarms. Run a flow test. Document results. Sign off. Move on. Instead, he'd left with a headache and a tight, prickling certainty in his chest. Something was wrong with that building. Not a paperwork issue wrong. Not a contractor forgot a label wrong. Wrong, like the system might not deliver the water it was designed to deliver. Wrong like a fire could turn those luxury banners into a cruel joke. Marcus knew it the way he knew when someone was lying, because the details didn't match the story they were selling. He remembered standing in the mechanical room on the first floor, the air cool and damp, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The main riser assembly rose like a metallic tree from the concrete floor, gauges like eyes staring out, a red-painted valve wheel, a tamper switch, the water flow alarm bell. The whole thing looked fine. Too fine. New installations did that. They were shiny enough to distract you. But Marcus didn't get distracted. He checked the gauge readings, tapped the glass, watched the needle. He asked for the plans and the contractor's test reports. And that's when the site superintendent, a white man named Brent Wallace, smiled at him the way people smiled at an inconvenience they were too polite to name. "Everything's in order," Brent had said, arms crossed over his hard hat. "We're on schedule. City's already been through. We just need you to, do your thing." Marcus had nodded, patient. "Great," he'd said. "I'll need the sprinkler contractor's flow test documentation and the fire pump curve if there's a pump." Brent's smile had tightened, like a belt pulled one notch. "We don't have a pump," he'd said quickly. "City pressure's enough." Marcus had looked past him at the riser and the feed. He'd seen the pipe size. He'd seen the elevation changes. 6 stories, long corridors, residential load. City pressure might be enough, Marcus had said, but we confirm that with data. That's why we test. Brent had laughed, a short sound with no humor in it. Man, he'd said, waving his hand, we've done this 1,000 times. Marcus had ignored the man. He was used to people calling him that, especially when they didn't know him well enough, or didn't care to. He'd set up the test anyway, attaching his gauge, opening the inspector's test connection, running the flow long enough to stabilize. And the numbers he'd gotten weren't just slightly off. They were bad, not catastrophic in the moment. Water still came out, alarms still rang. But the flow rate was lower than design. The residual pressure dropped too far, too fast. The kind of result that made you check your equipment twice, then check it a third time just to make sure your own fear wasn't biasing your eyes. Marcus had repeated the test with Brent watching, then with Brent's foreman watching, and the numbers stayed the same. When Marcus brought it up, Brent's friendliness had evaporated. "You sure your gauge is calibrated?" Brent had asked. "Yes," Marcus had said. "You sure you didn't set it up wrong?" Brent had pressed. "No." Brent had stared at him, then glanced at the white foreman as if looking for agreement in skin tone. The foreman shrugged. "Looks fine to me." Marcus had pointed to the readings. "This isn't a looks thing, it's physics." And then Brent had said the thing Marcus heard too often in rooms where he was the only black person. "Look, Marcus, I get it. You want to be thorough, but you're making a big deal out of nothing." The words were harmless on paper. The tone wasn't. It carried an implication. You people always make trouble. You people always think something's wrong. You people don't understand how things work here. Marcus had left Riverbend that day without signing off. He'd written up his findings carefully, professionally. He'd emailed the report to the contractor and to the building's developer. And then he'd done the thing that, in the industry, made people roll their eyes. He'd filed a complaint with the city. Not out of spite, out of fear. Because if the sprinkler system couldn't meet minimum flow requirements now, when everything was new and clean and unused, what would happen after a year? 2? When pipes scaled, when valves got bumped, when someone installed cheap fixtures, when pressure dipped in summer? What would happen when someone fell asleep cooking on the 3rd floor and a hallway filled with smoke? The city's fire marshal had called Marcus the next morning. His name was Harold Whitman, a man whose voice carried the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Mr. Reed," Whitman had said, "I reviewed your complaint." "Yes, sir," Marcus had answered. There was a pause, long enough that Marcus could hear the soft shuffle of papers on the other end. "Riverbend Flats is a high-profile project," Whitman continued. "We've had multiple inspections already. Our staff didn't note any deficiencies." Marcus had kept his voice even. "I understand, sir, but I have test results showing the sprinkler flow doesn't meet the design demand." Whitman had sighed, the sound of patience thinning. "Your company has had disagreements with contractors before," Whitman said. Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew what that meant. Someone had called him difficult. Someone had called him a problem. Someone had taken his professionalism and framed it as attitude. "Disagreements aren't the issue," Marcus replied. "Numbers are." Whitman's tone cooled. "Mr. Reed," he said, "we need to be careful about accusations. Construction is complicated. Sometimes private inspectors misinterpret readings." Marcus had stared at the blank wall of his small apartment kitchen. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Are you saying my readings are wrong?" Marcus asked. "I'm saying," Whitman replied slowly, "that you may be mistaken, or overly cautious. It happens. Overly cautious. As if caution was a flaw." Marcus had swallowed anger that tasted like pennies. "Would you like the raw data?" he asked. "I can send my calibration certs and test setup photos." Whitman had paused again, then said, "Send what you have. But I'm telling you right now, I doubt this amounts to anything." After the call ended, Marcus had stood very still, staring at his sink. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. His hands shook, not from fear exactly, but from the familiar frustration of not being met where the facts lived. He thought of his father, who used to say, "You can be the best in the room, and they'll still ask if you belong there." Marcus had become the best he could be anyway. That afternoon, he printed everything: photos, notes, gauge readings, time-stamped videos. He compiled the complaint packet like he was preparing evidence for court. Because in a way, he was. The court just happened to be the opinions of people who already believed he was wrong. Now, standing outside Riverbend Flats, Marcus watched a white SUV pull up to the curb. The city seal on the door was unmistakable. Fire Marshal Harold Whitman stepped out. He was in his late 50s, tall, neatly built, with short gray hair and a crisp uniform that looked like it had never met sweat. He carried a clipboard like it was an extension of his spine. Behind him, a younger inspector climbed out. White, blonde, maybe mid-20s, carrying a hard case and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Whitman's eyes landed on Marcus. For half a second, Marcus saw the calculation. Is that him? Then Whitman's face settled into something polite. "Mr. Reed," he said, approaching, "you're early." "I like to be prepared," Marcus replied. Whitman nodded once, as if marking a mental point. Then his gaze flicked over Marcus. Boots, bag, posture, and Marcus felt the old sensation of being assessed not as a professional, but as a question. Behind Whitman, the site superintendent Brent emerged from the building entrance, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. He walked toward them with a grin too wide to be genuine. "Fire Marshal Whitman," Brent called. "Good to see you again." The warmth in Brent's voice was sudden and obvious, like someone turning on a light switch. Whitman shook his hand. "Mr. Wallace?" Brent's eyes slid to Marcus. The grin stayed, but the friendliness didn't reach his gaze. "Oh," Brent said, as if surprised Marcus existed. "You're here too." "I'm the one who ran the test," Marcus said calmly. Brent chuckled and looked at Whitman. "Yeah, well, we'll clear this up today." The younger inspector shifted his weight, glancing between them like he could feel the tension, but didn't understand it. Marcus knew the look. "Please don't make me pick sides." Whitman cleared his throat and lifted the clipboard. "Let's get this done," he said. "We're here to verify the system performance and close the file." Close the file. Marcus noticed the language. Not investigate. Not confirm. Close. Already decided. Brent led them inside. The lobby smelled like new carpet and expensive air freshener. A soft jazz playlist drifted from unseen speakers, the kind used to convince people they were already home. Marcus followed, keeping his face neutral. He'd learned a long time ago that showing irritation only gave people a reason to label you. They took an elevator to the first-floor mechanical room. The doors opened into a corridor still dusty with drywall powder. Marcus watched Whitman's eyes scan the unfinished edges. Nothing alarming, but not quite the polished luxury the banners promised. The mechanical room door was propped open. Inside, the sprinkler riser stood as before, red and bright. The gauges were still installed. Everything looked right. Everything looked like it wanted to pass. Whitman stepped in and looked around with practiced confidence. "All right," he said. "Mr. Reed, show us where you tested." Marcus moved to the inspector's test connection, pointing. "Here," he said. "This connection simulates the opening of a sprinkler head. I attached my gauge at the riser to record static and residual pressure, then flowed water long enough to stabilize." Whitman nodded, but Marcus could tell he was listening like someone humoring a lecture they didn't need. The younger inspector set the hard case down and began pulling out equipment. His movements were quick and competent. At least someone took the process seriously. Brent leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Marcus the way someone watched a contestant on a game show they expected to lose. Whitman gestured. "Let's proceed." Marcus watched the younger inspector connect the hose to the drain, position the flow into a floor sink, and set up a pitot tube device to measure flow accurately. Whitman looked at his watch once, impatient. Marcus didn't rush. He knew the system didn't care about anyone's schedule. When everything was ready, Marcus nodded to the younger inspector, and the valve was opened. Water thundered through the pipe and into the drain, loud enough to vibrate the air. The room grew humid quickly, mist clinging to the cold metal. Marcus watched the gauge needle jump, settle, then sag. He didn't need to be a prophet. He'd seen it before. Whitman scribbled something on his clipboard. "What's your static?" Whitman asked. The younger inspector read off the number. Whitman nodded, as if satisfied. "And residual?" Whitman asked, voice clipped. The younger inspector watched the gauge, eyebrows tightening. He read it out. Whitman's pen paused. Brent's grin flickered, just for a heartbeat. Marcus kept his eyes on the needle. It held steady at a number that made his stomach drop. Not because he didn't expect it, but because now it wasn't just his number. Now it was theirs. City equipment, city witness, city responsibility. The younger inspector cleared his throat. "Sir," he said carefully to Whitman, "that residual drop is significant." Whitman didn't answer immediately. He stared at the gauge as if the needle might correct itself out of respect. It didn't. Marcus felt a small, quiet shift in the room, like air pressure changing before a storm. Whitman's jaw tightened. Brent straightened off the wall. "That can't be right," he said quickly. "We've got city pressure. Whitman raised a hand without looking at him. "Run it again," Whitman ordered. They did. Same results. A third time. Same. The younger inspector's face had changed from boredom to focus, to a kind of concern that made him seem older than his age. Whitman's confidence had begun to fray around the edges, like a suit that didn't quite fit anymore. Brent's skin had gone pale under the fluorescent lights. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't have to. Finally, Whitman exhaled sharply through his nose, as if annoyed at the universe for inconveniencing him. "All right," he said. "Shut it down." The valve closed. Water slowed to a trickle, then stopped. The silence afterward felt heavy. Whitman flipped through his clipboard and looked at Brent. "Where's the sprinkler flow test report from your contractor?" Whitman asked. Brent blinked. We submitted all that." Whitman's eyes hardened. "Not to my office. I want it. Now." Brent's gaze darted to Marcus, then away. "I can get it," Brent said, "but this is probably just... maybe the gauge is off. Or..." Whitman cut him off, sharp. "Get the report." Brent hurried out of the room, his earlier swagger gone. Whitman turned to Marcus, and for the first time, his eyes landed on Marcus like he was seeing him as what he actually was. A trained professional standing in front of facts. "You said you had documentation," Whitman said, voice quieter now. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. Printed copies, cleanly organized, tabbed. The kind of evidence you brought when you knew you'd be doubted. Whitman took the folder and began flipping through. The younger inspector leaned in, reading over his shoulder. Marcus watched Whitman's expression shift, line by line. Not outrage, yet. Something more complicated. A reluctant recalibration. Outside the room, footsteps pounded back down the hall. Brent returned, breathing hard, holding a stapled packet like it was a hot object. He handed it to Whitman without meeting Marcus's eyes. Whitman scanned the first page, then the second. His face tightened. He looked up slowly, eyes locked on Brent. "This report," Whitman said, voice dangerously calm, "shows a flow test failure." Brent swallowed. No, that's... Whitman tapped the paper. "It's right here. Your contractor documented it." They noted insufficient pressure and flow to meet demand. Brent stammered, searching for a story. We were going to, there was a plan to, maybe it wasn't final. Whitman raised the packet higher, as if presenting it to an invisible jury. And yet, he said, you requested final sign-off. You scheduled tenants. You ran marketing. Brent's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Whitman's gaze slid to Marcus. Marcus held it steady. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He didn't offer the satisfaction of, I told you so. Because Marcus knew something Whitman and Brent had never had to learn. When you're black in rooms like this, being right can be dangerous. Whitman looked back down at the failure report, then at Marcus's neatly organized folder, then at the gauge on the riser, as if the whole system had just revealed a different kind of truth. Not just about water flow, about who gets believed without proof, about who has to bring proof just to be heard. Whitman cleared his throat, the sound rougher than before. "Mr. Reed," he said, and the words came out different now, less dismissive, more careful. "You were correct to escalate this." Marcus nodded once. "I was trying to prevent someone from getting hurt." The younger inspector swallowed, staring at the report like it had teeth. Brent stared at the floor. Whitman's pen hovered over his clipboard. Then he began writing with sudden purpose. "I'm issuing a stop occupancy recommendation effective immediately," Whitman said. "No residents move in until this system meets code and passes verification testing." Brent's head snapped up. "You can't. We have leases. You'll bankrupt." Whitman's eyes were ice. "Then you should have fixed it when your own report told you it failed," Whitman said, "and you should have been honest about it." Brent's face reddened, and he looked at Marcus again, this time with something uglier than dismissal. Blame? As if Marcus had created the failure by pointing at it. Marcus felt the old heat rise in his chest, that familiar combination of anger and exhaustion. The part of him that wanted to shout, "You almost moved families into a building that could burn. And you're mad at me?" But Marcus didn't shout. He breathed. He watched Whitman sign the form, and knew this was only the beginning, because the report proved the sprinkler system failed. But it also proved something else. Marcus Reed had been dismissed not because of his data, but because of who he was. And now that the truth was undeniable on paper, the real fight would start. Not against pipes and pressure and valves, but against the people who would rather punish the messenger than fix the message. As Whitman closed the folder and handed Marcus back his documentation, his voice dropped. "Mr. Reed," he said quietly, so Brent couldn't hear clearly, "I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have doubted you." Marcus looked at him, his expression steady. "People doubt me a lot," Marcus said. Whitman's face tightened with something like shame. Marcus adjusted his bag strap and turned toward the door. Behind him, Brent's voice rose again, frantic, angry, full of entitlement. But Marcus kept walking, because for the first time in days, the pressure in his chest eased. Not because the world had suddenly become fair, but because the truth had finally been too loud to ignore. Outside, the leasing banners still flapped in the wind. Luxury living, they promised. Marcus stared up at the glass facade and thought, luxury doesn't mean anything if you can't survive the night. And then his phone buzzed again. "Tasha, any update?" Marcus typed one line. The report proved it failed. They can't ignore it now. He hit send. And in that moment, Marcus Reed understood something that would carry him through the battles ahead. Sometimes the first victory isn't changing someone's mind. Sometimes it's forcing the world to admit you were never wrong.